Welcome to another episode of Policy Talks. And I have with me a professor from Australia who has been in the news in Indian publications, particularly because of his article that has questioned the very basis of rankings by three multilateral institutions, mostly European, on the ranking that they give out to India. And his article has created you may say a storm or a storm in a teacup here, about how valid or how correct these rankings are, and should they be accepted at face value, or is there conscious or maybe unconscious bias which is leading them? So, welcome to Policy Talk, Salvatore. Good to have you on the show. I wanted to begin.
It's great to be here.
Thank you. I wanted to begin this discussion, this conversation with the basis of your article, which we'll also share the link in the episode. But your basis or the assumption is that these three institutions, which is basically Economist Intelligence Unit, VDEM, and the Freedom House, they are not giving the correct picture when they rank India's democracy. So, what do you think the bias here is?
First, I should be clear that I can't tell you what the correct picture is, because that would imply that I had done my own ranking of India's democracy. What I can tell you is the evidence adduced by these three organizations is very weak. In many cases, it applies to the wrong period, and often it is outright mendacious. That is, the evidence given in support of their own rankings doesn't correspond to the rankings that they have given India. So I can't say what quality India's democracy is. I'll leave that to Indians to decide. But I can tell you that the evaluations provided by these three organizations are not in line with their own evidence. It's not in line with the evidence they themselves have presented in order to justify the low and rapidly deteriorating rankings for India over the last 4 years.
So, do you think that this is a conscious effort by these organizations to bring down the ranking? Because all these three organizations have, over the last 4 years, as you point out the period, have, like for instance, EIO has put India into a bucket of 53 other countries, which also has France and some of the European countries as a flawed democracy. So even US is seen as a flawed democracy now. Do you think that EIU has done this consciously? And do you really think you can bring in conscious or unconscious bias in an index that is supposed to be reflective of variables that are data? They're not subjective issues in that sense.
I don't think any of these organizations as an organization has an anti-India bias. In fact, there's a lot of goodwill towards India in the West, and certainly among Western governments and certainly among Western investors and business people. The problem here is that the rankings they do reflect the general opinion of those analysts and intellectuals who cover the countries they're ranking. So when the Economist Intelligence Unit ranks India, it's not sending a team from its own central headquarters out to India to do fact-finding. They're instead sending a survey. And all three organizations work the same way. They send a survey to people who in the field who do have knowledge of India. Now, in India's case, that survey is largely going to Indian intellectuals, Indian university professors, or non-resident Indian, but people of Indian origin who are university professors and think tank analysts outside India. These are also going potentially to journalists outside India, and maybe some other book authors and intellectuals. We don't have access to the list of experts they rely on. The only thing we do know is that for each country, they're relying on people who have some acknowledged expertise on that country. Now, it doesn't take an outsider like me to tell Indians that Indian intellectuals, broadly speaking, I can't speak for every Indian intellectual, but if you were to take a survey of university professors in India and ask what party they voted for, I can assure you that Narendra Modi's BJP would not be top of the list. So I think what we're seeing
that's
here,
not true. I mean, like,
well, elite.
some
Let me correct that.
universities would, because of their ideology per se, a left-wing ideology, have professors who would.
Let me correct that.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Among elite university professors in the humanities and social sciences, these surveys are not going to physicists, they're not going to engineers, they're not going to mathematicians. These are going to social scientists and journalists only at the very top tier institutions, probably not mostly in India, probably among non-resident Indians who work at places like Harvard and Stanford, or even for that matter, University of Sydney. Now, I've met a lot of the people in this general social class. I've seen their writings. I've seen their books with titles like India, Democracy in Danger, or titles like Narendra Modi, The New Fascism, these sorts of things, the dangers of Hindutva philosophy. And they certainly have a right to that opinion. In no way am I saying that their opinions are not sincerely held, or even in many cases, fact-based. However, this is not a unbiased group of people who are dispassionately looking at the data. To put it another way, when I come to this table, I come to it as a comparative social scientist who's not an expert on India, who's an expert on ranking systems. When I look at it this way, I see there are a lot of problems with the methodology that these three organizations use, because inevitably people bring their own political biases into their evaluations of a country. I mean, I can see this in my own country. I'm American, and in the US, more than 95% of university professors who donate to a political party donate to the Democratic Party. If you try to evaluate Donald Trump's presidency and you ask a bunch of academics, you're going to get a very negative evaluation, regardless of what the reality of the situation might be. Now, it's possible that the reality is as bad as this group of experts say, but in answering your question very specifically, it's not the rankings agencies, the rankings organizations that set the rankings. It's their panels of experts who set the rankings. The rankings authorities are only reporting what their experts have said.
So you're saying that these indices have two parts. One is the panel of experts that they survey, and these panels of experts are, you're saying, are obviously biased against market-friendly policies or market-friendly political systems. Hence, they would the whole country as negative. And you're saying that Indian intellectuals abroad have a larger role to play in this, or a role to play in this?
They have a very big role to play in this. Again, I don't know the names of the people on the rankings panels, but I think we can safely assume that they involve the quote unquote the usual suspects. That is, journalists at places like the New York Times, professors at places like Harvard and Stanford. These are the sort of authorities that are depended on by organizations like Freedom House, Varieties of Democracy Institute, and the Economist Intelligence Unit. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I want to emphasize, if you want to know about democracy in a country, you should go to the experts on that country. The problem is when there is little or no editorial oversight, and the editorial oversight is so much lacks a real devotion to detail that errors even are reported in support of these negative rankings. And I can give you lots of examples of these errors that have been given in support of the rankings.
So, I mean, like, as you know, that even US or France is classified under a flawed democracy, and possibly at the same time that India was included or defined as a flawed democracy. So these two countries did not oppose or question or say that this ranking happened because a particular class of intellectuals was saying that this is biased, or the system, or this system of ranking is fundamentally flawed.
Sure, there are two reasons for that. First is that the US and France are at the top of that category, not in the middle or bottom of that category. These are very broad categories that are given by these organizations. So the US and France have not been downgraded to anywhere near the extent that India has. But the second reason is that Americans...
we only moved two ranks below. I mean, we're a flawed democracy.
Oh, the rank is far below. Oh, yes, but the rank is far below France's rank. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips. We can look them up. But the second reason is that France and the US don't care. That is, Americans and French people really couldn't care less what organizations in Washington or Sweden say about their country. Now, the problem is not that Indians have a thin skin. Indians should care, because India requires the cooperation of the rest of the world in a way that France or the US doesn't have to worry about. I mean, France is a member of NATO. France is a member of the European Union. France is not going to face anyone not being willing to invest there. It's not going to face any problems of people being unwilling to sell high technology equipment to the country. It's not going to face sanctions. These are not a problem for France, no matter what ranking France gets. It's certainly not a problem for the United States. For India, this is a problem. That is, there is the potential, for example, that the US would someday suspend technology cooperation with India if the idea becomes ingrained in American legislators' heads that India is not a democratic country. I mean, look at US-China relations. There's an absolute ban these days on US technology going to China. Why? Because there's a recognition that China is a hostile totalitarian state. Well, I routinely see Narendra Modi called a fascist dictator on websites, on Twitter. And when there are these ranking agencies that, okay, don't go that far, but when they back up that story, when they class India alongside Russia, well, then yes, many American legislators might be hesitant about entering into agreements with India in a way that they would have no hesitancy about France. They know France. They know French people know America. No one takes these rankings seriously. Look, my own president said twice on national television that Republican-controlled states were little better than the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Has anyone suspended investment cooperation with Texas or Florida? I mean, nobody, because we know not to take that seriously. That's just politics. That's just Joe Biden doing Joe Biden. But when someone says about India, we don't know India. I mean, who knows whether or not India really is a democratic country? When we want to know, we have to Google it. And when we Google it, we get VDEM, Economist Intelligence Unit. We hear from Freedom House that India is partially free and that Kashmir is not free at all.
That's interesting. So you're saying that I mean, if I were to kind of structure your answer, the three elements which are coming out. One is that there is a popular narrative in the common media, which is the New York Times and Washington Post, which is against India. And this popular narrative, when combined with the narrative among intellectuals inside India and outside India, is creating a false picture via these indices, which paints India as a partially free, flawed democracy, and other elements, which then, in the sense, forms an incestuous circle with what the popular narrative already is. And it strengthens that narrative further on. So this, I mean, we can argue this same cycle or this negative cycle happening for any regime, can argue for it or against it. But fundamentally, you're saying that this has geostrategic impact on the way India's international relationships are going to be structured. Now, that is a very interesting, and it almost borders on the conspiracy theory. That is there a conspiracy theory behind this popular narrative combined with this ranking that is affecting India geostrategically?
There's no conspiracy, but there is a lot of laziness. It's no surprise, as I said, that anyone who reads the newspaper will know that high prestige Indian humanities scholars and Indian social scientists are overwhelmingly Marxist or overwhelmingly secular or overwhelmingly anti-BJP. That's no surprise. The laziness comes in when the editors at these three rankings organizations don't put in the time to check up on the information they're being fed by their analysts, by the people who answer their surveys. I mean, look, we've been talking around this without getting into details. Let me give you the one most egregious example. The suggestion that journalists are not safe in India because more journalists are killed in India than in any other country in the world outside China. We don't have data for China, but more journalists are killed in India than any other country outside China. Well, anyone with 10th grade mathematics would say, but wait a minute, India has a population of 1.4 billion people. So when you do the simplest adjustment, when you ask how many journalists died per billion people in India, it was 3.5 per billion in the latest report. How many journalists died in the rest of the world? 6.3 per billion, almost twice as much. So India, in fact, is one of the safest countries in which to be a journalist. Now, I'm not in favor of any journalist to that death. I'd like to see that 3.5 come down to 0. We all would. And I hope you're safe where you're sitting right now. But it can only be mendacity for an editor not to just perk up and say, wait a minute, you haven't adjusted your figures for population size. There's a problem there. And that's the
there is certainly a problem there if you are not adjusting to size and you're taking an absolute number over on a large population. And the very reason you have per capita figures instead of absolute figures for comparison, or you adjust figures according to inflation, currency, or other things. So I mean, you would assume that if you're preparing an index, you would do that. I mean, unless until you are, as you pointed out, you're willfully trying to project an image that is not correct. And you see that happening in these three organizations. So I wanted to kind of come to the second organization a little bit more in detail. The second organization, as you pointed out, is VDEM, fully called as Variety of Democracy Institute. And this is being, it's a largely supported and funded by Swedish, Norway, and Denmark-based institution. The only other corporation that I saw heavily funding this organization and mentioned on their own page is Facebook. I didn't see any other large.
Well, they're also funded by the European. They're also funded by the European Union through the European Social Research Council, I think it's called, and I believe they receive, some U.S. National Science Foundation funding. But they're all highly reputable funders. There's no problem with the funding sources for the organization. It's an extremely reputable organization that has extremely reputable sources of finance.
So if the structure of funding is clear and the organization reputation is not in doubt, and the processes are still using 50% there and 50% dependent on samples which are biased, but more importantly, you're saying that there is mendacity there in the sense that there is willful creation of malice in the sense in their editorial narrative.
I don't know if it's willful. I don't know if it's willful or lazy. When you're doing rankings for 200 plus countries, and they are doing 200 plus countries, it's a huge effort. A lot goes into it. A lot of trust goes into the people who are feeding into the reports and who are writing the reports. There's a lot of delegation that goes on in creating these reports. Remember, they're not doing an India report. They're doing
165, yeah. EIU is ranking 165 countries, yes.
Oh, okay, 165 reports for VDEM. The problem is not in the overall process. The problem is in the credulity of the editors, the credulity of the administrators, who instead of going to their reports and taking a look at the evidence and saying, is that right? Can we really use that figure? Has that figure been properly compiled? They see a footnote and they let it go. Now, everyone does that. I mean, I've had interviewers ask me, how come Indian academics haven't raised these concerns? And I've told them, well, it's a lot of work. What I've done is gone through every single footnote in these reports, chasing down the original sources and asking, do the original sources support the interpretation that appears in the final report? And that's where all the evidence in my paper comes from. It comes straight from the evidence.
Yours is technically not a paper. It's still an article because you've not written it in a journal. I mean,
it's not a peer-reviewed paper. I mean, you call it a paper, call it what you like. It is not a peer-reviewed scientific journal article. No, it's a critique published in a literary magazine called Quadrant, later reprinted on the website of the print in India. But all the data are there.
Why didn't you kind of went in for a peer-reviewed, piece which could have been then used to correct the system of processes that these three institutions actually follow?
I may still. Originally, I'd planned this simply as a working paper at the University of Sydney, but the editor of Quadrant expressed an interest in it and said he wanted to publish it. So rather than having just the working paper, I thought it'd be great to have it published. I might turn it into a peer-reviewed paper. I'm going to be honest, though. it would be very difficult for me to publish it. I mean, the academic peer review process is romanticized by people who hear peer review means it's some endorsement of quality. In my experience, and look, I have a Google H index of 26, which is very good for a social scientist. I've published dozens of research papers. In my experience, it's very difficult to publish anything with which your reviewers simply would politically disagree. And I strongly suspect that the group of reviewers for this paper, if I send it to a journal, would be exactly the people I'm criticizing. And I would be very surprised if the paper made it through peer review. I might still turn it into a peer-reviewed paper. I haven't ruled that out. But for now, rather than just have it as a working paper on the University of Sydney website, we went with publication in Quadrant. But look, anyone can track down my references, right? I've been very transparent in everything in the article. The data are very clear. And I want to emphasize again, I have not rated Indian democracy in this article. I'm not saying Indian democracy is good, bad, or indifferent. I'm saying that there are a plethora of errors in the ratings that have been done by others of Indian democracy. And that should be clear to anyone who reads the article.
So just for our listeners and viewers, you gave one example of number of deaths of citizens, which is erroneously not extrapolated over population or compared on population scale. Give us other 2 or 3 examples of such erroneous comparison that has been included in the mentioned in your article and included in these rankings.
Sure. So sedition charges are very controversial in India, and the use of sedition charges has been routinely cited as an example of how the government is repressing political dissent. Now, the report, until 2014, sedition was not in the uniform reporting of the Indian justice system. So an NGO actually went back and compiled sedition records going back to, I believe, the year 2000 all the way forward to today, the number of first indication reports filed. Okay. They said in their report, over the decade, 2010 to 2020, sedition charges spiked. Okay, 2 things struck me there. First, it's odd to have a decade be 2010 to 2020. A decade's 10 years. It should be either 2011 to 2020 or 2010 to 2019. And the second thing that struck me was the word charges. Okay, I thought, wait a minute, let me look into this more closely. So the first trick, choosing endpoints. It turns out that the only period over which sedition first indication reports have risen is the specific period 2010 to 2020. If you go a year either way, they've declined, right? So essentially, there's been no trend in the use of in the filing of sedition first indication reports. There's no trend, but if you strategically choose just the right endpoints, you can make a case that they have risen. Okay. Second, a first indication report is not a charge. And so there's no evidence for charges before 2014. We just don't have the data. But first indication reports can be filed by anybody. Are these the government filing reports? Are these reports even leading to charges? Are there prosecutions going on? That's a whole separate matter. But in the report, this comes through to the reports as government charging people with sedition. Now, if I know that a first indication report is not a formal legal charge by the government, then by a prosecutor, certainly the people compiling these critiques know that. But they also know they could get away with calling it charges because who's going to know? Who's going to look it up? I give you another example, UAPA arrests. Again, as an American, I'm not a fan of emergency regulations. I would be very happy if international democracy organizations rated India downward because of its use of emergency powers like the UAPA. I would like to also see them do the same for Canada, which recently declared a state of emergency when truckers wanted to protest in Ottawa. That's a separate issue. The fact that they do it for India, not for Canada, okay, we can say, what about so-and-so? Okay, I'm much more concerned. UAPA charges have been flat, absolutely flat. You look at the trend, it's flat, except for a spike in 2018, 2019. Now, there is a spike up about 10% in 2018, 2019, and then right back down to flat again. So if you strategically pick a year, you can say between 2017 and 2019, there was a rise in use of UAPA, charge under UAPA. But if you choose any other period, you just get a flat line. Right. Well, of course, what you see in the reports is this cherry picking of the trend. Similarly, charges under the UAPA have been ascribed to the current status of Indian democracy, and have been used to substantiate a decline in Indian democracy between 2018 and 2019, when the charges were actually made before 2014. So the cases, if you read the detail, the cases that they're talking about are actually cases that were under the previous government. Yet, they're being attributed to this new decline in democracy that has just recently occurred. The reports are full of those sorts of, I think, mendacious details that I want to emphasize are not mendacious on behalf of the rankings agencies. They don't know the details. They're relying on those who are filtering up the details. What they haven't done is exercised appropriate editorial oversight to make sure that these kinds of claims don't get into their reports.
So is there one common institution or organization which is helping them build this, cherry picking the data for them? Or is there one or two or three different individuals who are doing this for these organizations? I just wanted to kind of
No. This is a class. This is a class issue. Look, you can argue with me all you want. I've read. I mean, look, I don't know who's Indian, who's of Indian descent, and who just happens to have a name that is extraordinarily Indian sounding. But I see all across the Western media, New York Times, Washington Post, academic, Harvard reports, Stanford reports. I see all foreign policy, foreign affairs magazines, all across that. I see reports, papers, articles with Indian sounding bylines that cast India in an extraordinarily negative light. Now, I don't know who's Indian and who's not. All I know is that it's pretty darn obvious to anyone. I mean, you don't have to have a PhD and be a professor to know that intellectuals don't like the BJP, and that the BJP, frankly, doesn't seem to like intellectuals. There's not a lot of love.
No, it's not.
There's not a lot of love between these two sides.
No, I don't agree with that part of it in that sense. But I mean, there is a set of intellectuals who've been sidelined by the current regime because of the fact that they represent a particular kind of thinking, which is largely left wing, which is more state dominated, which basically says that the state has to do everything and the markets and the private sector or society does not have to do anything. And that's the thinking that's been reversed. So it's not just the intellectual, all the intellectuals, it's just a set of intellectuals in one sense.
No, it's not everybody, but
yeah.
But look,
but it's been 6-7 years now.
Look, I don't have data for India. I have data for the US. And in the US, the data are so overwhelmingly clear that intellectuals tend to support the Democrats and they hate the Republicans, that the idea that this same pattern would replicate in India, frankly, I don't think would be surprising to anybody. It may be politically incorrect to say so. I can't give you the data for India. No one's done the survey as far as I know. But it's one of those things that, if the earth is round, the earth is round. And I can't prove it to you, but people can make their own judgment. In any case, it's the judgment of this pool of experts that is filtering up into these reports. It's not the three agencies themselves. And I really want to emphasize that to people. They're not sending out fact-finding missions to 200 countries. Their surveys are being answered by people who are bona fide, actual experts on India, and those bona fide experts are giving them faulty information.
So would you say that these three organizations need to widen their pool of surveys or sample size per se?
No, I think they need to be very cautious about being drawn into domestic politics. Look, if a country is relatively obscure, I mean, if I think of a country,
but India is not relatively obscure. I mean,
no. That's what I'm saying. If I think of a country like Burundi, or
Moldova,
or Bhutan,
maybe
Bhutan for that matter. If I think of a relatively obscure country, if the people who study that country are misrepresenting the state of its democracy, nobody will know because it won't make headlines. Ugandan democracy mischaracterized does not make international headlines. It's not reported in major newspapers in the West, never mind in their own countries. When India, so I don't know if other countries have the same problem. But when people use these rankings as an opportunity to fight their own political battles in an external arena, I think that's a problem. And it's something that those of us who are involved in rankings, I mean, I myself am someone who studies rankings, we have to be very careful about as methodologists, that we don't allow our respondents to use us inappropriately as a proxy weapon in their own domestic political battles. And I think that's really what's almost certainly happening with the rankings on India.
So you're saying that this ranking has been politically weaponized by the Indian opposition?
I suspect that I suspect that the pool of intellectuals who study India, who for the most part are themselves of Indian background, I suspect that they genuinely hold the opinions they hold. However, they are susceptible, like all of us, to reinforcing our own biases. When we hold this opinion, and it's a perfectly legitimate opinion, there's no problem for being Indian and being anti-BJP. The problem comes when you allow your personal political viewpoint to color your evaluation that's supposed to be objective. And I don't know for any one individual if that is happening, but I do know from the collated citations, the collated footnotes that have been provided to substantiate these rankings, I do know that some large number of people are misrepresenting India. And look, I've heard this as an academic. I've repeatedly heard things like, Salvatore, why are you supporting that fascist regime? And I hear this from highly credentialed colleagues. This is not, I'm not saying I hear this from people on Twitter. Well, I'm not supporting any regime. I'm just in the interest of truth. I'm only here to try to correct the record. And I'll say it for the third time. I don't have any evaluation to offer you of Indian democracy. I have an evaluation to offer you of the evaluations.
Thank you very much, Salvatore, for that evaluation of the people evaluating India's democracy. And I hope that people evaluating India's democracy do visit India to evaluate it. And they answer some of the basic questions that they have listed in that evaluation. Questions like, are Indian elections fair? Are Indian civil servants given the freedom to carry out their policies? These are some of the basic questions which EIU says determine the democracy, and if these questions are answered in affirmative, moniker of flawed democracy should be removed. Thank you, Salvatore.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.